to this afternoon's session. We're going to go straight into our keynote speakers, our inspirational speakers for this afternoon's session. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome to the platform Jake and Hannah Graf.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for all being here. This is only, in fact, the second in-person talk we've done in about 2.5 years, so it's lovely to be in a room full of lovely, smiling, happy faces. I hope you've all had a nice lunch. Good lunch?
Yes.
Wonderful. And I hope to keep you awake this afternoon, because I know after lunch, you know, it's that sleepy slot, as Hannah calls it. So we'll be telling you a little bit today about our stories. I'm going to start just my story, growing up as a young trans person in the UK, and then Hannah will carry on with hers, and then we'll answer some of your questions. And before we go ahead into the questions later on, I hasten to add, we are open to any kind of questions that you guys like. It's very important to us that you feel free to ask us pretty much anything across the board. So think of some questions, and we will endeavour to answer them later. So I knew from a very young age that I was different. My mother tells me that as soon as I was about 2.5, 3 years old, as soon as I could really speak or think, I knew that I was a boy, and it's something that I would tell her almost daily. And it was something I knew unwaveringly and unshakably. And back then, this was in 1980s London, and we were all living under Margaret Thatcher's Section 28, which is obviously a fairly vile piece of legislature, which meant that there were no representations of LGBT people really out in the media, and certainly none that I saw. I didn't see any visible transgender role models in the cartoons I watched after school, in the books I read at school, in the films that I watched, at the weekends with my parents. And in fact, back then in the 80s, the word transgender wasn't even used. It was transsexual at best, and certainly never with any kind of positive connotations. And this was at a time, obviously, there was no internet, so there was no resources. My parents couldn't find any information about why their little girl insisted on calling herself a boy. And there was just no information and no trans representation whatsoever out there. And so obviously that for me made for a very, very lonely and isolating experience as a young person. I just thought I was the only boy in the world who was born in a girl's body. And that obviously fills a young person with feelings of self-doubt, low self-esteem, low self-confidence. And like a lot of LGBT people, those are feelings that have lasted well into adulthood, and in fact I think still haunt me to this day. And so I began to live very early on in my imagination. I would be one day Luke Skywalker, Indiana Jones, James Bond. I had a favourite soldier outfit, in fact, that I used to wear to death. And, for most kids, this was a dressing up outfit. But for me, it was a way that I could dress as a little boy. And, as you can tell from how short the trouser legs are, I wore it pretty much every day for about 2 years before it was cool to have trousers that were too short. And this was my way of coping. And I actually began at a very young age. I had a little diary that my mum bought me in pink, obviously, where I would write stories where I was a boy, and just normal stories of being a normal little boy, and that was kind of my way of coping very early on, and in fact was the only area at school where I actually excelled and where I sort of always kind of wrote stories, and lucky because I have since become a writer, so that's kind of worked out well. And back then, I think for my dad, it was cute. I was a tomboy. We all know that it's acceptable to have little girls who dress as little boys, much less so, as Hannah will tell you, to have little boys that want to be little girls. But for my dad, it was cute, and we did everything together, and we were inseparable. But I think for my mum, it was much more worrying to have this little girl who only wanted to wear jeans, who only wanted to do the boy things. And so she responded by putting me in ever frillier and pinker dresses. So that was me standing on the front doorstep when I was probably about 4 years old. And I remember minutes before that, I'd been inside the house crying my eyes out, begging to be taken out of this dress. Because for me, it felt like a humiliation. I knew that I didn't want to be in a dress. I didn't want to be called by female pronouns. I didn't want to be called by my girl's name. And I began to dread at a very early age all of those moments which should have been happy childhood memories, birthdays and Easter and Christmas, because it invariably meant being forced into a dress. And, I remember before this picture, my mum had bribed me with 2 Mars bars just to smile for the camera. And this is not to say that I was not from a really loving, wonderful home. I was very lucky. I grew up around privilege in a middle-class family. It's just my parents hadn't got a clue what it was to have a transgender child. And for them, it just became a source of constant argument and caused massive fractures within the family unit at a very, very early age. So by the age of 5 or 6, I was being quite mercilessly bullied at school. Now, because I've always had quite curly hair, my mum let me wear it fairly short. But obviously, walking through normal life, I looked like a little boy. And my mum would obviously correct people every time someone said, oh, your son this or your son that. She'd say, no, that's my daughter. But when you go to school and you're all of a sudden the weird kid, the weird little girl who dresses as a boy, life becomes quite difficult. And even little things like going to the bathroom at school, I'd go into the girls' bathroom and the girls would all scream and say there's a boy in here. And so I'd go to the boys and the boys would all laugh at me. And occasionally there'd be a kind teacher who would see what was happening to me and who would let me use the teacher's toilet. But then obviously you're the weird kid using the teacher's toilet, so that's kind of even worse. So like a lot of trans kids I know still do to this day, I just stopped eating during the school day. It was just easier. I'd hide my breakfast in my pockets and just not eat or drink during the school day. And that was just easier than having that sort of humiliation and having that bullying of having to use the facilities. And it was around that time, when I was probably about 6 years old, that the older kids, who were only about 9, began calling me hermaphrodite, which is actually quite clever, but obviously very painful for a small child. I didn't really get it at first, but when I did, it really hit home. And luckily, I stayed in the same school until I was 16, so that was a name which did stick with me. Obviously, as with most trans people, I knew that looming ahead was puberty. And I think for me, that was a source of so much anxiety. I knew that any passing privilege, and obviously that's the privilege of being allowed to walk through the world and look like the gender that you feel you are to be, and I just looked like a little boy. I knew that was soon about to disappear, and that no matter how many baggy t-shirts I wore, as I was in this picture, my body would soon out me as a girl. And so I would pray every night to God that I would wake up the next morning in a boy's body, and I would strap my chest down or punch myself in the chest or do anything I possibly could to stop those changes from happening. And obviously nothing can stop those changes. And so I very quickly grew unable to look at myself in the mirror. I saw such an alien reflection that it was just easier not to look at myself. I began to loathe my body, loathe the changes. I became very insular, cut myself off from my family. My poor father didn't understand. We'd been so close up to that point, and all of a sudden I didn't want anyone near me. I recoiled from any kind of physical touch, and just became this very, very angry little 14, 15-year-old. And my parents didn't understand what was wrong with me, because obviously they'd showered me in love and had always been very supportive. It's just that obviously I was a transgender child and no one was helping me. And sadly, when my father actually died of mesothelioma when I was 18, we hadn't spoken properly in about 4 years. And again, like a lot of LGBTQ people, that's a regret that I'll have for the rest of my life, just not being able to repair those relations that quite often are sort of ruptured when you're young. And so by then life had got quite difficult, and I thought, I have to try and fit in, because obviously telling the world who I was and who I knew myself to be wasn't working. So I thought, right, I'm going to try and fit in. And I had a group of friends at school who were all girls who decided they'd sort of, make me over and encourage me to grow my hair, and they would put me in dresses and sort of send me out to the school discos so that I could hopefully be normal and find a boyfriend, do all those things. And so this was me aged probably 16, 17, and I was actually scouted in a mall to do a bit of modelling, and I ended up standing on Acton tube station platform doing this, thinking this is just so wrong and not who I am. And I'd never felt so uncomfortable in my life, and that lasted a couple of months, and then the hair came off again. And all up to that point in my life, I'd been told literally daily that I was a girl, and had that reinforced. And I knew that I'd always been attracted to girls. From a very young age at school, I was always wanting to kiss the girls during Kiss Chase. So I thought the only thing I could see that felt even a little bit like me was being a butch lesbian. And so I went out one night into Soho and found the one women's bar, the Candy Bar in the middle of London, and went in, met a girl within 10 minutes, and I had a girlfriend by the next morning. We were solidly together. And there, within the lesbian community of London, I actually found acceptance and belonging for the first time in my life. And obviously, if you've never belonged anywhere, that's a really heady feeling. Because there, I was sort of considered one of the girls. I was embraced, and it felt like a family. It was chosen family, but it was family. And I very quickly was out every night of the week. I was working behind the bar. I was promoting all the club nights. But unfortunately, that also meant I was drinking a lot. And for me, I found alcohol and I found substance abuse, and I threw myself into that so wholeheartedly because it gave me a sense of numbness and a sense of oblivion that I really needed, because by then I was 18 and I'd had pretty much like 15 years of misery. And so I threw myself into that community. And obviously, when you're out drinking every night for years on end, your body can't take that strain. And so at 25, I actually hospitalized myself with acute pancreatitis, and ended up in hospital for 3 weeks and very nearly died. And obviously that really scared my mum and my friends, but more than that, it really scared me, because I knew the way I was going, I didn't see a point in living, and I knew that if I carried on going the way that I was, then I wouldn't be here much longer. And so a friend of mine actually called from New York and said, look, I know I've heard what's happened, I know you're struggling. Do you want to just come out and have a change of scene and be out here and just, move away from the lesbian community and so on? So I did, I went out to New York and started fresh, and obviously within a week I'd found the lesbian community. But within that lesbian community, I met a young transgender man for the first time ever. And this guy was, this very sweet little guy who was out all the time with the other girls. And I was like, why is this guy here every night? And he said, he eventually told me that he was trans and he'd transitioned a couple of years before. And this guy, Nico, genuinely saved my life and talked me through everything from hormones to surgeries to how very soon society would perceive me and treat me very differently. But for the very first time, I'd seen hope, and I'd seen a possibility of what might be. And so I came back to the UK a couple of months later and put it off for a while, because I thought if I transition, no one's ever going to want me, no one's ever going to want to date me again. Trans people are made to feel like we don't deserve love, like we don't deserve to find that sort of connection. But then finally, I just couldn't bear it any longer. And I was about 28. And I broke down in front of my mum one day and I said, look, this is who I've always been. This is why all this has happened. And the first thing my mum said was, what are we going to do about this? And that just made all the difference, because I knew that she was going to support me, and I knew that I wasn't going to lose my family and I wasn't going to lose my friends. I was very, very fortunate in that she helped me financially to go privately, because as some of you may know, the trans healthcare waiting lists are astronomical, phenomenal, 3, 4, 5 years before you can actually get seen, let alone to have hormones and so on. And I was very, very fortunate that she helped me with that. And immediately with my first counselling session, the doctor said, of course, you're gender dysphoric, and let's help you with that. And so at the time, I decided to write the story of my transition, and it was a film that was the story of 2 women in a relationship, and one comes out and is promptly dumped, comes out as trans, is promptly dumped. And that's what had happened to me. I'd been with my girlfriend for about a year, and I said, look, I'm so sorry, I need to transition. This isn't who I am. And she said, well, I'm a lesbian, and on your way. And that was that. And it was, I made this film that premiered at the BFI, which was wonderful. So, we kind of screened at the BFI and then across the world. And it was the first thing I'd done in my life, pretty much, that I was proud of. And I put this film out online, and I started getting messages from young men in Afghanistan, Lebanon, Poland, Russia, saying, I'm transgender too, and I've never seen anyone like me, and I didn't know other boys like me existed, and you've given me hope in the same way that Nico gave me hope. And, I've been very fortunate since then. I've written 6 films that have all screened across the world. I've been invited to the White House to speak. I've told my story in the Houses of Parliament. Obviously, I'm here today, which is wonderful. And I've become one of the most visible trans men in the UK, and I'm incredibly fortunate. So I am truly testament to what can happen if a transgender person is simply supported, that we can achieve anything that everybody else can. Thank you. Are you clicking? Okay, let's stand here.
Hi everyone, my name's Hannah. I'm Jake's. There you are, hiding behind me. I'm Jake's wife, and I'm going to do something very similar, tell you a bit about my story and yes, we're both trans, and there are certain aspects of our stories that are similar, but equally, there are some areas where they can be quite different. So I grew up, I'm a little bit younger than Jake, a little bit. I grew up in sort of, I was born in 87, so I grew up in the early 90s in Cardiff in South Wales. And, I learned from a very early age not to talk about being anything other than a little boy, or to be a little boy. Because as Jake said, whilst it's sort of socially acceptable for girls to aspire to be sports people and, anything that's kind of deemed as masculine, that's kind of okay. Anything that society is deemed as feminine, for a boy to do that is somehow seen as deviant or wrong. And I think that's got to do a lot with the structure of how we see masculinity as more superior to femininity. But ultimately, I knew at a young age that I had to be something, and that was be a boy. And that's what I learned from a very young age. I really coped by doing the male things. So we put all these activities and say, this is what boys do, and all these activities, and that says what girls do. And human beings, we mix and match the whole thing, right? We're all different. There are girls who like sports, there are boys who like fashion. It's a real mix in reality. So I had parts of me that I'm very active and very sporty, and I'm very competitive. And so they were things that society said that was okay. Those are male things to do. So you're okay to do that. So as a young kid, that's what I threw myself into. And I was very sporty. My dad was a scout leader, so I went off and did lots of, scout football and all that kind of stuff. And that was how I kind of found joy in my life, and that's how I got through my younger years. But in doing so, at a very young age, I'd already compartmentalized my life and said that anything that was feminine, anything about me that was inherently female, had to be put away in a box and never spoken about. Now, when it comes to representation, as Jake said, when he was growing up, there was nothing. As I was growing up, there were some representations, but they were, and continue to be, extremely negative. The best example I can give you is a film called Ace Ventura Pet Detective. I don't know how many people in this room have seen that. I can see quite a few nods. For those that haven't, it's a family film. It stars Jim Carrey, big Hollywood film, and it's aimed at children. And in that film, Jim Carrey is the protagonist, and the antagonist is this woman that he kisses, and then later on in the film, he finds out that she's transgender. When that happens, he burns his clothes, he cleans himself in the shower, he starts scrubbing his mouth out with toothbrush to clean himself from kissing a transgender woman. And at the very end of the film, he actually outs this woman as trans by stripping her naked in front of a load of police officers who all start throwing up. I watched that film with my friends and my family, all laughing along. As a trans person, when you see that in your life by your loved ones, it's really, really damaging, and it really makes you feel that you have to hide who you are at all costs, because you feel if you tell someone that that's who you are, that's how you'll be treated by the people who love you and look after you the most. You can actually hear in my voice, I'm probably getting a little bit emotional about it, because it really does damage trans people, and it's damaging. That film is still shown on terrestrial TV today, still damaging young children. But as I grew up, I went to university. Here I am in my student digs up in Newcastle University, and this was, a strange time for me, because obviously further education is a time in your life where you're not just learning about the education. I did an engineering degree, but at that point you're learning so much more than just engineering. You're learning about, living on your own, being self-dependent, making social relationships, having relationships with, sexual relationships, all these types of things that people are experiencing in life for the first time, those life skills. That's what everyone else was doing. Well, I couldn't do that because I couldn't be me. I'd learned so much that I had to be someone else, that I really just was in my shell. And yes, I went out to the pub and I went drinking and I had fun with my friends, but it was always superficial. And behind that was the real me that no one else could see. This was also the time, however, that I had my first private space. So it was the first time I was able to find a little bit of my life where I could be me. So I would lock the door. No one else had the key, so no one else could come in. The internet was available, so I'd go into chat rooms and I'd present as a woman in these chat rooms because no one could see me. And sometimes I'd wear female clothes. I had bought a wig. All these things through online. And I then really started living this huge double life because I really knew that's who I was, but I had to take it off for public consumption. So I always had to flick between the real me and the me that the rest of the world saw. But following university, I decided to join the army. That's me at the Royal Military Academy Santos, which is where we do our officer training on sort of week 2 or 3. And look, there's a lot of school of thoughts about why someone like me, a transgender woman, would join the army. Certainly there's a concept whereby transgender women seek stereotypically masculine roles in society because we feel like we're trying to be the women that society wants us to be, or it's almost like we're trying to sort of cure ourselves from being a trans woman. Like if I do something really masculine, then all that will go away, and of course it doesn't. But equally, as I said, I've always been active, sporty. I love the army, the travel, the camaraderie, the teamwork, all these things that I learned, the leadership that I learned at that, in that institution, have been really positive for me. So I don't know where I lie. It's probably a mix of the two. But certainly people sometimes are a bit shocked that a trans woman would ever join the army. But I did. And also this was a strange place because it was the first time I was ever in a gender segregated space. So in Sandhurst, there were, not anymore, but there were female training platoons and male training platoons. And so I found myself even more distant from my true self because I wasn't even allowed to have that kind of daily interaction with the women that I was training with. And I vividly remember I'd hurt my leg carrying weight a week before, and I was on this run, and I was I was at the back of the squad because I couldn't keep up because my leg was hurting. And my colour sergeant, who's the guy with the pointy stick in training who shouts at you, and he said, Mr. Winterbourne, if you don't hurry up, I'm going to stick you in the girls' platoon. I'm thinking, yes, please, that's all I want. But of course it wasn't to be. So I did come out of Sandhurst, I did commission as an army officer, and even though it was one of the more difficult things I've done in my life, and it really drew me away from my true self, I still take a lot from what I've learned there, my leadership, and the career that it's given me since. And then shortly after coming out of Sandhurst, I deployed to Afghanistan for the first time. I took a platoon of people out to Helmand province, that's in Bastion, which is kind of the main UK and American base in Helmand province. And this was really the turning point for me, because up until this point, in my adult life, I told you I had always had a space to be me. I could go lock the door, I could be myself in private. Well, whilst you're in Afghanistan, there ain't no such thing as privacy. I lived in a tent with 7 guys, I had my bed space, my bag, and then the next guy was there. You don't have internet, you don't have the phone, there's literally nothing but your own mind and maybe a book. And in those dark moments, because when you're on operations, there's short moments of real adrenaline, but then these long periods of quiet where there's not much going on. And in those quiet moments, I just felt so far away from myself, and my brain went to some very dark places. And so I promised myself when I was out there that when I came back, I would never put myself in that situation again. And that's what led me to going to my commanding officer and saying, sir, I'm transgender. And like Jake's mum, he didn't really get it, but he said, okay, well, what do we do? How do we support you? How do we make it okay? And that's all you need as a trans person at that moment. You don't, you know the person across the, from the side of you isn't an expert, but you want them to just tell you it's okay and they still support you. They're not going to throw you out. I mean, I thought I was going to lose my friends, my family, my career, the respect of everyone around me, but he just kind of made it okay in that first moment, and that enabled me to take more steps. So I went through my transition. It's a long process with lots of ups and downs, but ultimately I became an openly transgender woman in the British Army, and something that to this day I'm extremely proud of. And look, the Army were actually very good. I think we all had this point of reference of being in a firefight. So you either train for or have been in a firefight when you're in the Army. And in that moment, you don't care if the person next to you is black or white or gay or trans or Christian or Muslim. You don't care about any of those things. You care, can they shoot straight? Can they run fast? If needs be, can they take you home to my family? And because of that, the armed forces as a culture actually is very good at valuing people for what they can do rather than who they inherently are. So I was just doing my thing very happily, just being myself, living my full life and being very, very, very happy about it. And then someone made a quick bob and decided to sell my story to the Sun. So I ended up on the front page. And at this point, my life just kind of blew up because I was having lots of requests for TV shows and more articles, podcasts, all that kind of stuff. And I just found myself in a position to maybe change the narrative. And I never sought to go out in public and tell my story, but I remembered that young person that I was that had nothing positive to look out there. And since then, I've tried to use my platform to talk positively about trans people who are just happy, productive members of society, just being ourselves, because that's what I hope other trans people who are slightly younger may look up and see. And so since that time, I was very fortunate enough to be awarded an MBE. There I am, Prince William at Buckingham Palace for my support of trans people in the armed forces. And it just goes to show, as Jake says, if you support trans people, if you give them the same opportunities as anybody else, there's no reason why we can't achieve the same as anybody else.
So there we were in 2015, both of us doing fairly well in our lives. We both transitioned, we were both a lot happier, but we were both alone. And I think there was one thing missing, and obviously that was someone to share all that with. And I, at the time, I'd sort of consulted on a film called The Danish Girl, which some of you may have seen and popped up in that film. And so I was kind of doing the press tour of that. And Hannah, in turn, was doing her sort of tour of, she'd been on Lorraine and the One show and the Victoria Derbyshire show, talking about her experience of being trans in the military. And so we'd kind of vaguely crossed paths. And Hannah actually popped up on my Facebook, People You May Know. And so, I thought I'll just add her one little pop, and I got a message straight back from Hannah an hour later saying...
It was much longer than an hour.
Half an hour later, just saying, seen what you're doing, think it's great, really, all your exploits are wonderful, would love to meet soon. So I thought, well, obviously she's keen, great. So we started what can only be called the most embarrassing Facebook flirtation ever, which is all still there, commemorated forever. And we went back and forth, and we were, it was sort of very innocent flirtation. Hannah was very honest from the beginning that she'd never been on a date before in her life, because she'd never felt comfortable enough to do that. And there was obviously a bit of interest there, so I eventually said, look, why don't we have a phone conversation? But Hannah, because obviously she has a slightly deeper voice, didn't want to get on the phone, she wanted to Skype. And I thought it was the weirdest thing in the world, because who has a Skype before they've had a phone call? So finally I got her on the phone, and after the sort of hello and how are you, I said very honestly, look, I want marriage and kids, and if you're not interested in all that, then let's just stop this now. And to Hannah's credit, she didn't run screaming. She said, obviously that's something I might be open to down the line. We kept on talking, and a few days later, on the 30th of December 2015, Hannah and I met for our first date. Because obviously she'd never been for a date before, I told her that we'd meet at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because I thought if it all goes wrong by 6, I can still go off and see my friends. So I did get the emergency phone call at 6 o'clock, and I was like, no, we're all good here, thank you. And we had this wonderful day where we talked about everything except being trans, which was wonderful. We talked about hopes, dreams, family, marriage, music. Being trans didn't come into it, and there was so much relief there on both sides that I wouldn't ever have to come out to her, that she wouldn't have to come out to me, that we wouldn't have to explain to each other's friends or families who we were. And by 8 o'clock in the evening, we were having dinner. By 9 o'clock, we had our first kiss by the South Bank in London. And by 1 in the morning, we were sitting, kissing on a sofa in a private military bar off the back of Waterloo, while some 90-year-old war veterans, sort of like agog, stood and pretended to play cards. And the next night, on the 31st of December 2015, I actually left my friends at 10 o'clock after dinner to go and meet Hannah. And I actually cooked her a second dinner at my flat in London. And I thought it was very cool. I said, do you want to watch my films? So, we sat and watched my films, and Hannah cried, and that was it, really. It was a done deal. And we then began what was effectively a long-distance relationship. Hannah was stationed up north, but she would visit me every single weekend. We grew very, very close. And I remember a few weeks into us going out where Hannah actually said, it really amazes me that I'm here, because when I transitioned, I knew, or I thought I knew, that I was giving up on ever finding anyone who would love me or anyone who would ever want me. And it still surprises me that I found someone. And that just, for me, was absolutely heartbreaking. And this is unfortunately how trans people, particularly trans women, are made to feel in the media. Just as undeserving, which is obviously certainly not the case. We were inseparable. And after about a year, I think, a year, 18 months, Hannah decided that she would leave the army after a decade, and in the army you have to work out a year's notice, so it wasn't like it was just a sort of overnight thing. But Hannah finally moved into my flat in London, and on the 6th of September 2017, I took her out to New York for a holiday, and took her out on a rowing boat on Central Park Lake, and I actually got down on one knee and proposed. And this is us moments after Hannah had accepted my proposal, which was lovely. And it was just the most perfect afternoon in the sunshine in New York with jazz playing across the water. And it was incredible. I actually, before that, had asked for Hannah's hand in marriage from her father because we're very traditional. And so, the whole family was involved. It was really, really beautiful. And a few months later, we actually married in London at the the old Chelsea Town Hall, which is where my mother actually married as well. And this photo, we put it online. It was actually on the front page of The Sun again with a terrible headline, Tran and Wife. Where did he get these guys? And the thing about this photo that people always mention online is the support and the love behind us and how rare that is to see with trans people. The family, there's on the one side there's Hannah and my mother, and on the other side there's Hannah's dad and my stepfather and all our family and friends. And we realised quite early on that we'd become a bit of a beacon of hope for people, for other trans people or LGBT people who felt that they were never going to find love because they weren't worthy. And hopefully we continue to give them hope to this day. And once we'd married, we began looking for a surrogate because we really, really wanted to be parents. And we found a wonderful Northern Irish paediatric nurse called Laura who approached us and said, we'd been on Lorraine saying we were really looking for someone. And she said, I'd love to help you. I've seen your story and I would really like to help you. And I think what really blew Hannah away is that anyone would want to work and help with a trans couple to be parents. And it was incredible. And she amazingly got pregnant the first time. And the pregnancy was very smooth. Obviously, COVID did hit in the last month of her pregnancy. And so we had to bolt over to Northern Ireland in the middle of the night. But we were very, very fortunate that on the 14th of April, our little baby Millie was born. And there's us just a couple of days after. And again, this is something neither of us ever imagined in our wildest dreams would happen. And here's our little Millie today. And as some of you may know, we are actually leaving to Belfast tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. because our surrogate is giving us another little baby next Wednesday. So, yeah. So it has been, we are, again, just incredibly fortunate, and I wish that all trans people were as lucky as we have been. Thank you so much for listening.
I think you'll agree that was a really inspirational story. Thank you both for being so honest with us. And this is the Experience Skills community, and we have all sorts of groups that support students that are gay and lesbian and bisexual and trans. And it is one of those big challenges. We've got an LGBTQ network that we support staff who are supporting learners. And I know there's going to be lots of questions out there. I've got some, but I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. So this is an opportunity to ask Jake and Hannah any questions. So has anybody got a hand up? One right at the front. The microphone's coming straight from the back. If you can put your hands up so I can see where you are, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth McCaffrey. I'm from the Gangmasters and Labour Abuse Authority. Thank you so much for sharing that. Really very moving, and it's, I think, embarrassing the way this country is and the way this country treats transgender people. I used to work in the Government Equalities Office and was involved in the consultation on the Gender Recognition Act. Mm-hmm. I know, right? It's embarrassing, and certainly I've moved on from that area. The things that are happening around conversion therapy now are a disgrace, and I just wondered really what, there's a whole load of Tory MPs in the next room. If you could get them to do sort of one or two things that would really make a difference for trans children growing up now, what would those one or two things be?
I mean, as you say, unfortunately, the political landscape around trans people is extremely challenging. There's bad representations that we talked about in the media. They are coming out of people like across the other room on a daily basis, and not just them. People in other parties too. It's a cross-party issue. The main thing is that, and what I hope maybe some of you have taken away from our talk today, is that we're human beings. Like we aren't like scary monsters hiding beneath the bed. We don't want to infringe on other people's rights. We don't want to make people miserable. We just want to live our lives and just be free to have the same opportunities and access to things that everyone else does, and that's the first thing. Because I think if we get that right, then everything else becomes a little bit more easy. And it was specifically with the children. I think trans healthcare is absolutely outrageous. Jake talked about some of the adult healthcare in the timelines that we face, but children are demonized, and their family and their support networks are demonized for just doing what's right by their children. And I think most people will think that trans healthcare for children is like, oh, you say you're trans, chuck here's some hormones and chuck them down your neck as quick as you can. But it's not like that at all. There's so many gates and hoops to jump through. So many people have to say yes and agree, and there's actually huge amounts of safeguards around it. And unfortunately, a single incident or a few instances where people feel like that it wasn't the right decision for them have now prevented just whole swathes and hundreds of children and their families from having the healthcare and the support they need. So, I mean, trying to sum up what they'd like them to know in one or two sentences is really challenging. But I would just say, know that we're human. Like, we really just want the same things as anybody else, and that's just to live happily.
And can I just add, this myth that we keep hearing about, just no children know about their gender, no child can decide, no child, it's just like, I know young gay kids who, from the age of 3, knew that they were gay, and, I think most people know who they are from that age. Yes, some kids come out later, know who they are later, but this nonsense about, let them just enjoy their childhood, don't put your gender ideology on them. I lost my childhood because I was so miserable. I know countless other transgender children who are crying themselves to sleep every single night. They're not having a childhood because they're being denied that healthcare. They are losing every minute of their childhood because they're being denied that healthcare. So all this nonsense from largely the people across the room, and it's also very important that we don't have our leadership speaking out against trans women. As we know in the last few weeks, it's a very big signal to say that you are essentially signaling trans people out from a conversion therapy ban, because it dehumanizes us and it makes it okay, and it basically puts us out there as targets. It's all right to discriminate against trans people because the government's doing it, and it's all right to discriminate because the Prime Minister's saying that trans women shouldn't be in single-sex spaces. And again, there is a lot of work to be done, as you say. And Hannah actually said a couple of weeks ago in a talk that she feels more scared walking down the street now than she did through the back streets of Helmand Province. And I think that is really telling. We've got transgender friends who in the last couple of weeks have been beaten up, who've been spat on, who've been shoved, because when that's the culture that's created from the top, that emboldens people on the streets. Like when we saw after Brexit, the racists all came out in force.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got a question?
One at the back there, I think, at the back there.
One at the back. Oh, sorry, yes, one right at the back.
I should just say, do feel free to ask us, and don't worry about terminology or asking things in the wrong way. I know some people are a bit worried about getting things wrong. This is a real an opportunity to ask questions if you have them.
Hiya. My name's Ollie. I actually work for the Skills and Education Group. Obviously, before today, I read both of your bios, and Jake, I know that you've got history in cinema. And Hannah, you mentioned the Ace Ventura film and the scene in that. As a big fan of cinema, we are slowly but surely seeing more representation with gay and lesbian relationships. But apart from the Danish Girl, I can't really think of any films that feature transgender roles. What do you think the industry could do more of to sort of put that focus in, or put that more in the public eye, if that makes sense?
I mean, we are seeing more and more representation, and some very positive. I mean, I recently watched Euphoria, which some people in this room may have watched Euphoria, where there was just a young trans girl in this show, and it's not at any point referenced that she's trans. It's not at any point referenced. There's no transphobia. She literally is just a character, and it was actually quite jarring that we didn't. Everyone knew she was trans, and she would mention it occasionally, but it was just she just fit in. There was just this feeling of inclusion throughout the whole thing, and obviously that's where we want to get to, where eventually people don't have to come out. No person should ever have to come out and face that worry and that anxiety and that fear of rejection and so on. But there are, I think, more and more positive representations. If anyone's seen Pose, which was great, and which was I think the biggest ever cast of trans women, particularly trans women of colour, that we'd ever seen, and Pose was great. What else has there been recently?
The thing that is jarringly obvious is the fact that most representations of trans people, even when they are positive, are of trans women. I think that's because people find trans women more fascinating, our transitions are perhaps more visible, but I don't think there's ever been any large film that starred a trans man playing a trans role.
No, to this day in 2022. But things are slowly improving. I think what really needs to happen, and we are, whenever I go to a talk or a panel at the BFI, what needs to happen for anything like this is that there needs to be from the very top, just like it's always got to come from the top, and then the culture sort of, it permeates into the culture. But within those writing rooms, we need to get people, people of color, women, trans people, LGBT people. They write those great roles, and then the great roles are there from the top, and you've got to make sure that you've got directors who are trans, you've got to make sure that you've got actors who are trans or LGBT or of colour or any other minority, that you're seeing it from the top. And if those characters are being written, then you can't erase them, and then obviously you're seeing that, and that in turn becomes the culture within the industry, and that's the only way it's going to happen. But it is happening slowly but surely.
I'm conscious of time, and I know you two have some really important things to do in terms of going home and preparing for your new child. As I said, the audience we're all from colleges and providers dealing with and supporting a whole range of students. I was talking to a senior leader in a college who have 20 trans students in their college. Wow! And I was struck in terms of the research I was doing for you two coming today, and you came out in what you said, Jake. I mean, in terms of it's not just dealing with in the learning environment the challenges and the issues, but back at home, not necessarily being able to be honest or accepted for who you are. And I just wondered what advice the two of you might have for colleagues here as they support students that are either just coming out as trans or transitioning, in terms of that pastoral support that they may well give, in terms of the advice and support you might have.
I mean, I think that what you got to remember is that trans people, we are all different. Our transitions are different. Our support networks are different. So there's no one right or wrong way to support a trans person. You always have to kind of adapt it to the situation, and most of that is about listening and understanding. So you might have someone who comes forward as trans who doesn't have a supportive home life, and therefore, that environment that you're providing could be their one let up in the day where they feel like they can be themselves, and that can be a really valuable thing. Or they can have great support at home, but maybe things aren't going right in the classroom, and each of those will have those different challenges. I think the main thing to know is that you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to have all the answers. The main thing is about just saying that I accept you for whoever you are, and I want to make sure that your time here, your experiences here, and the things you do here are as valuable to you as possible, and we'll support you through it. After that, it becomes a conversation. And it's really about just understanding the individual needs and working out what is right for them, but making them feel like you accept them for who they are, using the pronouns they prefer, using the names they prefer. That is what trans people need. We feel validated there, and then we feel comfortable to tell you what our specific needs are, and then you can work through it. So the main thing is just knowing that they're human beings. They just want to, they want to get the same thing out of college as anybody else, and just knowing that it's okay, and just give them that support and say it's okay. We welcome you here.
I mean, it's really encouraging that you're saying that we are seeing so many trans young people being able to come, and trans older people being able to come out, whether it's in the workplace or at college. When I went to university some 20 years back, I actually dropped out after 2 months. I started doing film at Westminster, and I walked in, I was so unhappy and so uncomfortable and had such self-doubt, and there was obviously no one was talking about trans anything, that I just couldn't, I felt so uncomfortable in every single situation that I couldn't do it, and I unfortunately left that education, never went back. So it's really encouraging to hear that young people, and as I say, sort of mature students who are trans or LGBTQIA are being supported, because that's important. That's the only way they're going to get through their education.
And the other thing I would say is just, there are a lot of specialised services out there. So for kids up until the age of 19, there's a great charity called Mermaids that support gender non-conforming children, their families and their wider support networks. And there are multiple other LGBT charities out there who have the specialist knowledge and can give you the special advice to get through those more specific points. So also don't feel like you're alone. If you really feel like you're alone, then ping me on Instagram and I'll do my best.
Thank you. And having cut off our FE Week editor earlier, I'm going to give him the last opportunity to ask a question. Hopefully I'll get back in his good books now.
Maybe. Hi, I'm Shane. I'm the editor of FE Week, with a sector newspaper for the further education sector. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think a lot of us had some quite profound, illuminating moments throughout that. I want to come back to the video though that you showed at the beginning, because quite a lot of that was your interaction with public services. So there was scenes in sort of healthcare settings, and one of the things I feel quite hopeful about in terms of the future is the way that I see young people really tearing down the sort of gender constructs that generations before them have put up. And what I hear from colleges now who are recruiting 16-year-olds from school is that they're seeing more and more young people who are expressing non-binary options and being much more upfront and confident than my generation was, have been able to say that they're different, identify as a different gender or different in other ways. There's a really boring sort of bureaucratic point to this question, which is that at the moment, none of these people who take on students can do so unless they tick a box to say that they're male or female. And that's a fairly unique part of the further education sector, actually, because it isn't the same in, as far as I'm aware, in the benefits office or at a university. But for some reason, this sector demands that the leaders in this room have to force a young person to put them in one box or the other, even if they don't identify as either. So I wanted to ask you about your interaction with public services and how that, what impact that has on your experience and your confidence in feeling like a member of society. Because I don't think we're putting enough pressure on our decision makers at the moment to make the changes we need to make to make our part of the public service as accessible and as welcoming as it should be.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, and certainly, my example in that film is a true example of interacting with my bank, and I've been locked out of my account on multiple occasions, and not allowed access to my funds because someone on the other end of the phone just assumes that a woman can't have a voice like mine, and I've had to, I've been told no and no and no, and that's it, and only when I've escalated it through a newspaper to get them to say, can you respond to this, when I finally got someone on the phone and got it sorted. And so it is, the struggle is real. Unfortunately, society has been built as a binary gender, male and female, and as if it's immovable, and that's something that trans people have to navigate all the time. And you're absolutely right. One of the things I'm really hopeful about is that younger generation are saying, nah, and it's not just the people who identify that, but it's their friends and the people around them are also coming on that journey with them. So I do hope that in sort of 10, 15, 20 years, we will see a more open and understanding society. But I would absolutely agree with you, within the confines of what you are able to do, it should be made clear that every time that you force a non-binary person or a trans person to tick a box that does not suit them, it's harder for them to gain what you're trying to deliver. And in the world of education and trying to give people, more options, more potential to be what they want to be in their lives, you're adversely impacting children and young adults and older adults. All these people are being given less options and less help. Because why? That's the way they were born. That's fundamentally wrong. And these kids and these people need just as much support as anybody else. And so, it's not easy in this. When you're fighting a system, it isn't easy, and that's why change can take a long period of time. But I don't think that necessarily excuses ourselves from at least trying and doing our little bit. And if you get enough voices and enough people who agree, then there will, eventually change will happen.
And unfortunately, what is coming out a lot from across the hallway again is just muddying the waters. The new talk of people like Hannah not being allowed into women's wards in hospitals, which has been going on without incident for years and years and years, decades, and not being allowed into single-sex spaces. And it obviously does. It's not that it feels. It is very much that we're going backwards, and a lot of our rights that we have fought so hard for are being withdrawn, or at least we are being threatened with having those withdrawn. And I think the whole thing, it's very worrying, it's very concerning, but you're right, much more work needs to be done across the board, and we need to stop rolling things back and roll them forward.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Can you do me a favour and give this amazing couple a big round of applause in our thanks? Thank you so much to both of you for sharing and being honest, and I know that that's had a big impact on those of us here in the room this afternoon.